Okay, Colonel Prouty.
Yes.
Okay, let's start off by talking about your background.
Well, I was, rather interestingly, a cavalryman just before Pearl Harbor and actually have ridden military horses as far as 600 miles. Not many people have done that. It just happened that we were with one of the last units, and when we came back, we were put back into the armored force. I stayed in the armored force for several months because I already had a flying license, a civilian flying license, and so they were calling up all the people with flying licenses to go to Air Force training. So they shifted me to Air Force. On November 10th, I became an Air Force pilot, and by February of 1942, I was in Africa with the Air Transport Command. So that's the beginning of my service. A little bit confusing, but it was rather interesting to me to go from horses to tanks to aircraft in less than a year.
That's quite a span.
Then in Africa, we were pretty busy there because, if you remember, the Middle East fighting against Rommel and that sort of thing was taking as many people as we could move there. And in our function, we were carrying cargo and special stuff that had to be delivered quickly. And as time passed, several months, I got called to fly a VIP flight, and a general from Washington, in fact, his name was C.R. Smith, the founder of American Airlines, was in Casablanca. So I picked him up in a party of 4 people. He wanted to go to Cairo, and he wanted to go to Tehran. So we flew there, and from Tehran, he said, we're going to make a special flight. We're going into Saudi Arabia. Well, we called Saudi Arabia violently neutral. It hadn't declared for either side.
Right.
But they had arranged with the Standard Oil Company of California to go in there, and we were the first official party to go in and talk with the Arabians and the Standard Oil Company of California about the future of the oil business in Saudi Arabia. And of course, you know, that's quite a story by itself. But then General Smith wanted to go back to Cairo, and he would go back to Washington. But in Cairo, we got there just at the beginning of the Cairo conference. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Roosevelt, Churchill, and I can't remember the third.
Stalin?
And Chiang Kai-shek.
Okay.
And they had a pretty interesting conference because they covered this oil business while they were there, which most people don't realize. It hasn't been in the news, or at that time it wasn't. But Roosevelt ordered them and set up the procedures within our government to build a 45,000 barrel a day plant for oil processing in Saudi Arabia, because we would need it when we started moving over the war over into Japan.
Right.
We were running short of fuel.
Uh-huh.
So, and believe it or not, within less than a year, they were actually delivering oil from Saudi Arabia and sending it on ships to Japan. Well, also, Roosevelt had come to Cairo for the Cairo conference. We stayed there about 3 days, and we were told to fly our group to Tehran. Well, of course, those of us who were flying had no idea what was going on, really, except we flew these people as such. I went out early in the morning, got the plane ready, and shortly after, a couple of cars came out with some dignitaries bound for Tehran, and they were Chinese. And the interesting thing about that is that if you read about the Tehran conference in history books, you will find out they never mention the Chinese. The British, Chiang Kai and Stalin from Moscow, and Roosevelt. But they never mention that the Chinese were at Tehran. Kind of interesting because it shows how some of these things are done, because there was no question about it. I flew a plane load of 8 men who were the staff, really, of T.V. Soong, the brother of Madam Chang, and also one of the wealthiest men in the world. And undoubtedly, those wealthy men and their leader were the ones making policy for the Chinese at that time.
Uh-huh.
Well, after that conference, and I won't go into it unless there's a question later, but I went back to Cairo where I became the chief pilot, and we had flying, oh heavens, we had 406 aircraft there and 1,200 pilots. You can't imagine how busy it was. flying across Africa from material that had been brought to the States to the west coast of Africa, and then flying across India and on into the war area in southern China and Burma and that sort of thing. A good bit of business. I stayed there for, I think till the end of the year, and went to a 4-engine flying school, been in a twin-engine flying, and was transferred to the Pacific, and happened to be on Okinawa at the surrender of the Japanese. So that was the end of my wartime business. It was very interesting, really. When I look back, we were extremely busy, and we're kind of glad to see that things kept moving. We never had any real setbacks. And at the base I was working from in California, I received orders to go to a school where they were training us as instructors to begin an ROTC program for the Air Force. Air Force had not had one before. It was part of the Army's ROTC up to that time, as the Air Force was part of the Army up to that time. And after going through the school, I was assigned to Yale University as one of 3 instructors sent there to open up the school. And interestingly, the pitcher on the Yale's baseball team was a fellow named George Bush, and he was a pretty good one.
Right.
Then from there, starting up the ROTC in many colleges throughout the country, there was an enormous demand for textbooks because this course hadn't been taught before. So I was moved to New York City, where I worked with a printing company, and wrote the first book on aeronautics as a textbook for the Air Force, and a part of the book on munitions that did the guided missiles. Missiles were coming in, and they had not been written up much for textbook work. So I wrote those 2 books, and then received orders to go to Colorado Springs. And we opened the Air Defense Command there. See, with Air Force coming in new, there were a lot of commands that had to be set up for the Air Force, more or less dividing, breaking away from the Army's work. And one of the important ones in those days was the Air Defense Command, where I was the head of the personnel planning business. What was interesting about that was we used the first major grouping of computers for such work in the Air Force, keeping track of all the activities in the Air Defense Command, 77,000 people, and we kept all their records and all that. It was the first time computers were used for that. That's how I happened to get into computer work later on. And from the Air Defense Command, which was in Colorado Springs, I was transferred to Albuquerque, New Mexico, for a short course in nuclear power, nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. And of course, in those days, it was real new. The first nuclear bombs we had heard about was right there in August of 45.
45?
Yeah, and we were, by the end of 46, realizing that we had to get into that. So I went down to Albuquerque, where the atomic energy people had a very active bit of work. And it was quite interesting because most of us hadn't even known a thing, and we had no place to learn about these things before the war, and we didn't have time to learn about them during the war and until they were exploded in Japan. I flew over Hiroshima, fortunately with a camera, the few days after the city had been hit by the first nuclear weapon, and it was absolutely devastating. It was just unbelievable. I had seen cities that had been terribly bombed, like Rostov in the Soviet Union.
Right.
And it couldn't compare with it. Just wiped out the city of Hiroshima.
Just horrific damage.
Yeah. Then I went back to Okinawa, and of course, well, then I'll bring it back up to date. I was in New York writing the textbook, and then kind of hard to keep up my memory. all of these things as the years go by.
Sure.
But having worked that way as an instructor and then as the first author of the book on aeronautics for the Air Force, I was transferred to Tokyo back into Japan, this time, though, in a peacetime setting, because we were doing everything we could to get business started again in Japan and become more or less allied with Japan instead of having them be a bitter enemy. And as I stepped off the airplane in Tokyo with orders in my pocket to go to the Korean War zone and be stationed somewhere in Korea, a colonel came up to me and he said, "Are you Colonel Prouty?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "You're not going to go to Korea. We need you here. We've got orders for you here. The Air Force has changed your orders." And I became the commanding officer of Tokyo International Airport, which was very interesting. The Japanese had been hit so hard that there was very little left of their airport, and one of the third busiest, I think, in the world as far as aircraft activity was concerned, and yet the airport had been blasted, and Mullen had to do that. Well, I stayed there a few years, and pretty interesting work, really, but I won't go into it because it gets pretty complicated.
Okay.
But I worked closely with MacArthur and the Japanese and the cooperation in that time, and it was kind of interesting to think that one day we were deadly enemies, and here we are a month or two later working together to rebuild not only the airport, but as MacArthur was doing in the city,
right,
the country. I received orders from there to go to the Armed Forces Staff College in Norfolk. So it was back into moving days. We closed up our home in Tokyo and went to Norfolk for a school that lasted 6 months. And from there, I thought I would be going back to the Air Defense Command, but my orders again were changed, and I was sent to the headquarters Air Force, to the Directorate of Plans. And here began a rather interesting career. The CIA had just come into being, and there was a sort of no understanding of just exactly how the military services and the CIA would work together, although obviously we would support each other. And what they did in the Air Force was to set up an Office of Special Operations, and I was put in charge of that, and then I was sent over to the CIA, where I went through a school that lasted for, heavens, about 2 months. And then went to a meeting with Mr. Dulles, Alan Dulles, and he said, "Look, after that training, we want to send you around to meet the various leaders we have in each government where we have people working for us." So that was the beginning of a round-the-world trip. Took off going toward London and then kept going until we got to the Far East and back home. It was very, very interesting because even though this wasn't too long after the wartime, we could see how our military forces, through such things as NATO and other agreements with countries, and then this arrangement with the CIA, which was actually in 42 countries, we could see that the United States would be pretty dominant in this world for years after World War II. I came back from that, and from that time on, I worked with the CIA in Special Operations. From the Air Force, was moved up to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I worked in the same job there, but for all services. And then with the transfer of the government from Eisenhower to Kennedy, they also transferred some of the functions in the Pentagon, and my job of Special Operations was transferred to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which actually was a much better place for it. And I worked there for a couple of years through the Bay of Pigs days and things like that, where I worked daily with the leaders of those things so we could get aircraft for them and other things they needed for these jobs that they were, because everything was new. The CIA had just been created and they didn't have any equipment. And Eisenhower wouldn't let them get equipment. And then we went under the Kennedy administration. Well, in the late summer of that year, which was 1963, I was asked if I would join a group going to Antarctica. It's kind of a surprise after what I'd been doing, and I went to a briefing at the White House with the Antarctica Committee. The Antarctica people are based under the White House because I think we have some pretty strong plans for the improvement of things down there. And I was told that President Kennedy was very interested in using nuclear power, small nuclear units about the size of an office desk,
right,
not these monstrous things that are all over, and that we wanted to start one of them down there and then see how it worked. And if a group of them down, I think they planned about 18 or 20 of them down in Antarctica, they would bring them back to places like the West Coast where there's water shortages from time to time. They'd want to desalinate ocean water and have other uses for power because Kennedy could see that the improvements of nuclear power over what we were doing would be considerable. And the type of unit they were building was perfectly safe. We could use it in every city and so on. It's quite an interesting program, and we brought about 50 scientists and manufacturers down there, people that were working in the business.
Right.
So after being down there and seeing the unit that we were there the day they turned the first unit on, and when they turned that unit on, you could see the beginning of a new era because it was a very effective operation. And from Antarctica on the way back to the States, we were in Christchurch, New Zealand during the end of November, and a congressman who was in the party and myself were having breakfast, and we heard the New Zealand radio come on their early morning program and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, BBC have announced that President Kennedy has been shot dead in Dallas." And I'll never forget the way that came through the radio.
Yeah.
There were about 200 people in the dining room, I would imagine, this beautiful big chalet we were in the mountains there. And everything just stopped. Nobody moved. The waiters just stood still. People put down their cups and forks and so on. It was just astounding to see, even down there in far-off New Zealand, this had a tremendous impact. Oh, it took us a few days to get back from New Zealand to the States. And by that time, things were changing drastically. For example, and a very important point that I'll go into later if you or others wish to talk about it, President Kennedy had signed orders to the government, to the CIA, and to the military that by Christmas time of 1963, he was going to bring home 1,000 men from the war in Vietnam. In other words, indicating his intent to get out of the Vietnam War in 1963 and 1964. And by 65, he wanted every American, and it said American personnel, not just American troops, but
everybody.
This would include the CIA.
Right.
And would be home, and in other words, he was going to be sure to get us out of the war by 65. A very few presidential statements that came in during my 9 years while I was in the Pentagon and this other work have been as impressive and as shocking across the country as that. And it just happened that my boss in the JCS, General Krulak, father of the present Commandant of the Marine Corps, by the way, so I don't want to confuse the two names.
Okay.
But my boss had been given the job of writing that directive and asked me to help him, so I'm very familiar with it. I have copies of it. And yet, if you look in history books of the period and in newspaper accounts and magazine accounts, you'll find that there is no such document as NSAM 263.
There's no such document, you mean, that would never be recorded or was removed?
Well, with the death of Kennedy, whoever was behind this thing had another document already written. In fact, it was written on the 21st of November. That was the date of it. I have a copy of it. And by, about the 29th of November, 6 days after Kennedy's death, President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, put out another document the reverse of Kennedy's, that we're going to build up in Vietnam, we're going to win the Vietnam War and all that sort of stuff, regular flag-waving business.
Right.
And you can see there's more to know about Kennedy's death in those few things, those few activities, than in all the Warren Commission reports and everything else we've had since. The people in the government are not going directly to the point. They have those documents. They know what they meant. But even today, years later, we can't get the issue across. Well, I won't go much further. Within a month, I had retired, and that was my end of my military days. I retired to become the vice president of aircraft company and so on. But it's a pretty interesting period, and especially when you are close enough to the center of government, where, as I used to do, I would get a telephone call and say, Mr. Dulles would like to see you. I'd go to Mr. Allen Dulles' home, the man who was head of the CIA. He would say, Prouty, we're going over to my brother's house, and so we'd get in the car and go to John Foster Dulles' home. And maybe there'd be one or two others there, like the chief of staff of one of the services or something. We'd be discussing a certain subject, and I could really see how the business area of that kind of government operates. And for instance, one day there was a very serious problem. A plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union, and it was really a mistake, but it was becoming serious. We couldn't solve it. We didn't want to go to, the Dulles brothers didn't want to go to Eisenhower without some sort of arrangement worked out. So I saw John Foster Dulles just casually walk over to his library, to a shelf. There was a white telephone there with no dial on it, nothing. He just held it for a second, and somebody came on at the other end. He said, yes, I want Mr. So-and-so. Yes, he's not in Moscow today. He's such and such, but I'd like to speak to him. In other words, John Foster Dulles himself would bypass all of the rest of the government structure and go directly to a civilian acquaintance and work with him. And Allen Dulles, of course, who had the same kind of experience, would do the same thing.
You're talking about someone in the Soviet Union, a civilian in the Soviet Union?
The man that he talked to was a civilian in the Soviet Union.
My goodness.
He was, no question about it, was a powerful man, because what we were doing, the crew of the plane that had gone down, by the way, was a transport plane, a DC-6, that was being used by the CIA. And the crew that was on it, and the few passengers that were on it, they were on their way to Pakistan and got off course, and MiG came up and fired a gun at them and cut off the inboard engine, and they obviously had to land. Well, here there were all these CIA people with their briefcases and everything else in the Soviet Union. Pretty embarrassing situation. And this is what Dulles was working out privately with some senior person in the Soviet Union, because it was an explosive situation if they realized what had really happened.
Good heavens. Now, Colonel Prouty, I'd like to turn our attention, if you don't mind, to your book, The Secret Team. You published that in 1972, is that correct?
I think it was in 73, but that's all right. I was writing it in 72 and 73.
What was the thesis of the book, The Secret Team?
It was the CIA, and I call the book The Secret Team, and it was let me make sure I read it right off the back of the book. Just a moment.
Okay.
It was the CIA and its allies in control of the United States and the world, and I called it The Secret Team.
Now, that in and of itself, that statement is a very powerful statement and implies a considerable amount. Can you explain to us what that means in detail? Well,
remember, this was, except for the Vietnam War and a few other things like that, was what we would ordinarily call a post-war period. I don't know whether most people have realized that our participation in the Vietnam War began on the same day that the Japanese signed the surrender in World War II on board the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay in front of General MacArthur, the 2nd of September, 1945. But at that time, what we were doing is our part of our Army people who had been in China, busily working on the war, had come down into Vietnam, Hanoi, with Ho Chi Minh, who was our ally. He was living up in China with our army at the time, and they brought him down. And that day, September 2nd, he got up on a platform and declared the independence of the government of Vietnam, and we were supporting him. In fact, as a plan for the invasion of Japan, armaments for at least 500,000 men to invade the country had been stacked up in Okinawa and would be delivered to Japan for the fight, which is normal, the same as we did in Normandy, perhaps a little more elaborate. And what happened was that when this Ho Chi Minh went to Vietnam with our military, including a General Gallagher, the ships were already moving not from Okinawa to Japan, they were moving from Okinawa to Hanoi, with half of that 500,000 of weapons, and the other half was going to Korea. Well, this is an amazing thing. It was not in the press, nobody identified what was going on, but I happened to be, as I said earlier, on Okinawa. I was talking with the harbor master. I said, "Are you sending all that stuff back to the United States? It's unused, it's been in big packing cases." No. He said, "Heck no, that'll never go back to the United States." He said, "Half of it's going to Vietnam and half is going to Korea," predicting in 1940, what are we talking about? By 1945, yes, 45, predicting a war to start in Korea and a war to start in Vietnam.
Which the Korean War didn't start till...
When you get with this secret team business, how you can see things being done.
Now, are you saying then in the book, The Secret Team, I mean, the first chapter, it says the real power structure.
Mm-hmm.
Are you saying that essentially that the business of national, international government, a lot of this is just window dressing for something that is going on at a much deeper level that has to do with a lot of money and power, that has no national identity, if you will?
You're correct. Your statement is pretty correct, because even if you watch the type of things that's going on today, you can tell that the way things are moving is not something voted for by the people of the United States.
Right.
Not something voted in Congress, and to a degree, not even happening in the White House. Just listen to what's coming out of the White House these days. Is that what's governing the country?
No.
Well, something has got to be governing the country. They just passed enormous budget figures and all that. We've got to agree to how to do that. There is no question in my mind, especially as a result of my experience with this sort of thing, there is a secret team that is not just people, powerful people of the United States. It's others also. And
they have no national identity. They're above all of that.
Well, it doesn't work that. I've had other people say that, and that's a natural conclusion, and I'm just laughing because I've heard it so often.
Okay.
They have national identities, but they're powerful throughout the world because they're the wealthy people. They're the bankers. I was a banker for a while before my retirement from that work, and I went to a meeting in London one time where a man spoke to 8 of us from around the world that were gathered at that meeting, just 8 bankers, and we were all in the vice president class, not the presidents. And just before the meeting started, the Englishman that was sitting next to me said, "Do you know this speaker?" And I said, "Well, I know his name, but I don't know him." He said, "He is worth $8 billion, and here he's coming into this room to talk to us. We're just 7 or 8 young bankers." And you see, this is the way some of these things are done. And, of course, in many ways, they're the most effective way to get it done in the modern world where communication is absolutely global and absolutely instantaneous. we run it pretty much together.
Okay. Now, let's talk about now I know that you were consulting with Jim Garrison on the movie JFK, and Mr. X, the man in the JFK movie, which was played by Donald Sutherland, was in fact based upon your career and yourself. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I'm kind of curious. I've covered on my program Eisenhower's farewell speech, which I know that Oliver Stone incorporated into the very beginning of the movie JFK. What was Eisenhower telling the people when he was talking about not allowing ourselves to come under the undue influence of the military-industrial complex? What was he warning the country about?
That's a good opener. In fact, I think it's the opening paragraph of the book I wrote for that period.
Yes.
The power, especially at when Eisenhower was leaving, that was because he'd had his 2 terms in office, and so it was already on the calendar that Eisenhower would be leaving.
Okay.
And the Republicans the incumbents then, were very carefully bringing Nixon up to the level of presidential material and preparing Nixon for the next 4 or 8 years of Republican power. And in the process, they were holding a number of meetings, and among them, for instance, rather interesting, we had on the boards certain procurement orders in the military establishment as high as $4 or $5 billion. One was an airplane, a fighter plane that would be the TFX, we called it, that was going to be built by Boeing, and there were some submarine ships for the Navy, and a lot of money. And what they decided was, we won't pass those laws now, those procurement authority, because this will improve Nixon's status when he becomes president. He'll have a lot of money to spend. The Eisenhower government is solvent. They left with a bonus in the Treasury. So a group of very powerful presidents of major companies and their associates agreed to hold back this enormous amount of money, particularly that $4 billion that would have gone to Boeing. And then when Nixon would be in, it would be ready for him. And Congress approved of that. Well, when Kennedy won with the narrowest margin ever given to a presidential election, I was working in the Pentagon, and I was working for the Secretary of Defense. You should have heard the uproar in the Defense Department. It was just absolutely terrible, because they weren't about to let Kennedy have the money and the procurement that the money would buy, and to change their policies. But you could see that didn't begin in the military. It began with groups of company presidents and bankers and other very wealthy people, and not only people in the United States. And I was sitting right there in the corridors, about 4 doors down the hall from Mr. Gates' office. He was the Secretary of Defense. And my job was working with CIA on a daily basis, the Office of Special Operations. Mm-hmm. That's about the best answer I can give you if you want some details. I mean, they had all that planned, and then Kennedy upset it. That's why Kennedy came in as a target the day he came in. It wasn't on the 23rd of November, 1963. They had decided they'd have to stop the Kennedy flow of money and all that. And that's why several of Kennedy's cabinet were incumbent cabinet members, like Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, just moved right on into the Kennedy government for a while until he fired them.
Okay. Now, let's talk about, forgive me for not knowing Mr. Lewin's first name, the gentleman that wrote the report from Iron Mountain. Do you know his first name? Was it John Lewin?
Lewin, Leonard Lewin.
Leonard Lewin.
Interesting, yeah. You brought that up. It's sitting right on my desk.
Okay. The report from Iron Mountain was a very interesting document, something that is today still hotly debated over its authenticity. And I know that Mr. Lewin, Leonard Lewin, has issued a statement saying that that was nothing more than just fiction. However, a lot of people believe that that was an actual project that took place, a think tank project, to determine, the future of foreign policy. What is your take on that?
Well, I know Leonard Lewin. When I had the book, The Secret Team, published, my agent up there in the company knew him pretty well, and I'd go to New York and see one of them, and the other one come in. Lewin was extremely sincere about the work that he wrote, but he realized he would have to cloak it in what he could claim was fantasy, whereas he was really very sincere about what he wrote. He wasn't fooling anybody. He was trying to tell us the truth of what was going on. What
was going to be taking place, or what was going to be shaping foreign policy for years to come.
Yeah, and what he really believed it to be. He has had to say a few things differently since then. However, there is a very interesting op-ed page article that he wrote several years later explaining to the public that it was a sincere book and it was not a fiction.
It was not a fiction?
And anybody that wants to look it up can find the New York Times of that date, or I've got a copy of the thing. I'll fax it for them.
Okay, Colonel. Let's go back to the business of the CIA. Was the CIA, and I'm kind of curious to find out what came first. The old scenario: what came first, the chicken or the egg? Was there some design, or has there been some design for quite a long time to bring about this type of government, secret government, if you will, secret team, or was this something that occurred after the inception of the CIA?
Well, that's a good way to put it. The CIA was passed as an independent, part of an independent organization.
Intelligence gathering organization.
Purposes.
For which, I'm sorry, sir, for what purposes?
For intelligence purposes.
Okay.
Then, shortly after that, Eisenhower, and he's to be given credit for this because he tried to do it what we might call in a well-organized fashion, issued a document, NSA M5412, if any of your friends want to write that down and look it up. It's printed by the government, and you can find it. And this said that the CIA would be responsible for covert operations that it was directed to do, directed by the President, by the National Security Council, and then they would, rather than have their own aircraft, their own artillery, their own weapons, they would get those from the services, because after all, the military had them. In fact, one time I shipped 42,000 rifles to the rebellion in Indonesia. I mean, it's sometimes a pretty large things. But it would all be done that way, by the National Security Council and the President approving the project, then the services providing the support, all kinds of support. And then the CIA would do the job, but the CIA would do the planning for it. They would know which ought to be done, and they would more or less present that to the National Security Council. So it was a new thing completely, but Eisenhower's idea was that if you're going to have a powerful intelligence organization, it has to back up what it knows as soon as it can and as powerfully as it can to do some good for the country and the world. And he thought this was the way to do it, and keep them from doing little private operations on the side that no one had control of. And that was his dream. Well, when Kennedy was elected, just a few days before before Eisenhower left office, he had an important personal meeting with Kennedy describing this, and then made a public speech about it, that the CIA's role was intelligence and so on, and how it would be controlled by the President and so on. That was the original intent of the law. That's the way the law was when Eisenhower signed it.
So it would be under the control of the President.
Right.
But between the time that Eisenhower signed that law, what year was that? Was that in 52?
in 62 or maybe early 6. I seem to think it's in January 63.
Okay, so in other words, the CIA was signed into law in what year was that? 40 or 51 or 52?
I think you're right.
Okay. Between that time and the time that Eisenhower enacted NSAM 5412, would you say that he had intimate knowledge that things had gone awry and that there was going to be potentially a control issue because of it?
Well, if you remember, it was a rather unfortunate time for Eisenhower. He had 2 heart attacks.
Right.
John Foster Dulles, who was his man on this sort of thing, had died. He was voted out of office. He had quite a few personal burdens and he was an elderly man. So that my view of it, and I was close enough to hear others talk about it this way, was that he did the very best he could. He spoke to the incoming president and had him understand his view, didn't have to try to sway him, but he wanted him to know his view because he felt that it might not be understood by a new administration. But the American public, I think, have been told a lot of things that they need to have reviewed.
Right.
For instance, Kennedy was the son of the ambassador to Great Britain in the period before World War II. And as such, he and his brothers were very familiar, more so than most young men, with world events. Then he was in the Navy during the war. Then after the war, he was elected to Congress as a member of the House of Representatives. And then after that, shortly right after that, he was elected in the next senatorial race, and he became a senator.
Right.
While he was a senator, Lyndon Johnson, who was head of the Foreign Activities Committee, appointed Kennedy to that committee. So he began to meet with the Foreign Affairs Committee regularly. He knew that there couldn't have been a young man more highly qualified through experience and his own ability than Kennedy to be president of the United States, really. And I repeat that many times because I don't care what people think about Kennedy and that on a political basis. That's his life story, and that equipped him pretty well for the role he was going to.
Sure, I agree. Let's talk about the Nazis and the I guess the thing that's known as Operation Paperclip.
Which one?
Operation Paperclip. The one where we brought the Nazi scientists and doctors over.
Oh yes.
Okay, let's talk about that because I know you had some involvement in bringing them over. You were the commander of the operation that actually provided the transportation or logistical support to handle that. Is that correct?
Yes. Now, look, I think it'd be a good idea just for one moment here. You're bringing up subjects that have been pretty quiet for many, many years.
Okay.
But I have written 2 books on these subjects, that Secret Team and the JFK Vietnam book, CIA book, that Oliver Stone used.
Right.
And then probably about 100 articles. I've had a new CD-ROM come out about 2 weeks ago, and it's available. And I think you know the contact for that, and you can handle it. I'm not going to sit here and advertise.
Right, I understand.
But some of the material that I used, no other, at least civilian author, has had a chance to get hold of these things. And I have been writing this ever since, well, it was way back when I was at Yale. And anybody that questions or is interested in knowing answers to these and wants to see it in print, there they are. So I just wanted to mention that. This is not imaginary. I had these things on my desk, and I still have them in my file cabinets.
Right.
Now, you wanted to know about Paperclip.
Right.
At the end of World War II, we knew that there were numbers of German and other European scientists who were very advanced in certain fields. In fact, the evidence of rocket aircraft that the Germans had flown and the nuclear business and things like that, the scientists knew about, and for some reason we didn't have quite as much experience in that as they did. So men like that, Werner von Braun, for instance, who built had the plans for the first flight of the rocket to the moon landing. Kind of interesting. We talk about that with a good senator on his way, ready to go. But they were all brought to the United States, and as many as they could, thousands of them. Well, we had to have aircraft pick them up that were not in the regular scheduled system, and it just happened that as a function of my job in the Air Force in those days, I sent the airplanes for these men as they came over, 6 of them on one plane or 20 on another plane and so on. I think we brought all told about 1,500 or 1,700. Anyway, it's all, I'll have that all listed down. And the idea was that we might just as well capitalize on what those men knew already about science and military equipment and so on.
Right.
That we didn't know, rather than to try to work our way up through it. And I talked to Werner von Braun quite a while when I was writing my book. And it was when I was writing that book, and it was in the munitions book for the ROTC textbook. And it's amazing to listen to him because he was angry at Hitler, but of course you can't do anything if you're angry at Hitler.
Right.
That Hitler wouldn't use the nuclear weapons the way he thought they ought to be used, or he being Werner von Braun. But yes, you're right. We brought, I think, in during my time with Operation Paperclip, probably 4,000 to 5,000 scientists to the United States. If you look in a book like the Register of Psychiatrists, which is a good-sized book, I think about 13,000 names and brief biographies in there, you'll find that over 1,700 of them were among this group that came in from Europe, and they're just the psychiatry people.
Now, I'm curious about when we're talking about the Nazi Operation Paperclip and psychiatrists and people like that. I know that you've spoken to the subject of MK Ultra, which was the CIA's mind control experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, the country was shocked in the mid-'70s to hear that the CIA had engaged in covert or clandestine experimentation of drugs on unwitting American citizens, among many other things that were allegedly done, and that several of the records for those projects were destroyed by Richard Helms. Now, I'm curious to find out what the thrust was of MK Ultra, and whether or not, and this probably calls for speculation on your part, but I would appreciate if you could speculate for us. What was the main thrust or the main purpose of behavioral modification programs that the CIA was looking into? With what you know about the kinds of things that have gone on and what the CIA has maneuvered itself into place to be, could it be possible to speculate that MK Ultra was essentially a program that they wanted to utilize to make their job of management of societies, including the United States, easier?
You know, that is a very, very important question, and I hope that your audience understands the area you're getting into. CIA was not designed to do mind control work.
Right.
It was created to do intelligence work. In other words, pick somebody else's mind, but not mind control.
Right.
By I'll say the latter part of the 1950s, CIA was given the job of this MK Ultra, which is the mind control and related works, and very elaborately so. It was no small deal. And I'm sorry I can't sit here and read a paper that's 14 or 15 pages long, but I have that material. But I would like to recommend to any of you that are really interested in this that there's a fellow named Walter Bowart, B-O-W-A-R-T.
I'm familiar with him.
Okay, who has written the book Mind Control. Now, I worked with Bowart, but anyway, there is a marvelous book, a very authoritative book on this subject of how MK Ultra came into being and all that. I am not experienced in the mind control work myself.
I understand.
I had to put it together, and I had to bring people over from Europe and that sort of thing. So I know about it, and I know all about it pretty well. I think that I'll have to say that's the way you can get a good answer, good, believable answer to your question.
Okay. Now, one other question if I may, on this particular subject. You said that Dulles or whoever, the CIA, was given the task to get into mind control. Who was the person giving the orders to do this? Well,
it takes the president. What they did is, first of all, there were committee meetings at various parts of the government when it was realized that there was this resource available for controlling minds, and even more than that, controlling everything you do. And that we ought to study it, and we ought not to be blind to it. We should be leaders in the world in it. Having done that, the committees then went to the National Security Council and briefed them and convinced them that this should exist. And in being asked, well, are we going to set up a new organization for this? And they said, no, we'll make the CIA responsible for it. They've got the people that can do it, and so on. So the National Security Council then went in, as is their business, the National Security Council, to brief the president, who was Eisenhower. And having briefed him, he agreed to establish this organization, this responsibility under the CIA. However, he stipulated clearly that it had to have been approved by National Security Council, by the president, and that any equipment or other things that had to be put together would come from the Defense Department. But it's a very highly formalized bit of work, but it's under the control of the CIA.
Okay. Let me ask you one more question that might be speculative or would require speculation on our part. I'm curious to know if you have any feel or understanding of why, and this might sound like an offhand question, but it's something that's on the minds of several people. Why does the occult figure so prominently in the MK Ultra background? Is there some reason for that?
Well, first of all, because it's so effective when it's done the way they do it. And I must make clear to you and others that I retired from the service in 1964.
Right.
So you know there's an awful lot
that's happened since then.
Since then.
Right.
But it's like when you plant a tree, the person that puts the roots in the ground made the tree. So in a sense, I listened to the early work on this, and I have books on it and all that sort of thing. But I just think it's fair to you and your listeners that they know that I'm not day by day current. But it was clear to me, for instance, if you look in this Register of Psychiatry, which is a national book, you'll find out that out of about something like 13,000 people in it, a large number are in this group that was flown over in the early question you asked me about what the heck is that, the flights across the ocean with all these people, paperclip.
Right.
They're the same names, paperclip, are in this Register on Psychiatry. It is a very dominant activity, but few of us understand it.
It's something too that, as you said earlier, that would require some attention, shouldn't it?
Oh yes, very much more than it gets.
Would you say it could be the heart or the meat of the entire subject?
Well, from one point of view, yes. We break these up into several different things, but this mind control stands by itself as a real
serious problem,
real potent problem, because the state it's in today is so far above anything we generally knew about in my active time.
Okay. Would it be fair to say that perhaps a lot of what they discovered and perfected under the experimental phases could possibly be operational today in the world?
Oh, there's no question about that. Not just our own program, but others in the world. The Soviets, the Chinese, the British. They're nothing to stop, and they meet together. See, this is the other thing when I was talking about governments. At that level, when you're talking something like that is so potentially dangerous, it's not a military agreement you have to get together. It's even more important than that. They have to agree on what their limits are if they think that humanity is going to stay together, because some of these things are extremely dangerous and extremely powerful, depending on who's got control of them.
Uh-huh. Let me ask you another question. I know you commented on the CD-ROM that you talked about, which our listeners are going to be able to get a copy of, ordering it from Lynn Osinick. But you commented on the subject of UFOs. Now, we have covered on a couple of programs. We've been dealing with several people. One of them was a Canadian researcher. What do you think the possibilities are that UFOs, or what we know to be UFOs, were in fact Nazi disk technology that was brought over here with the scientists that you're talking about, and that a lot of the reports, the UFO reports that have been turned in over the years, over the last 40, 50 years, are the product of observation by citizens and military personnel who do not know, the program and the design and that type of thing. How many of these reports could actually be attributed to possible technology that we were working on?
That's a good question. When I was in Tokyo, I was the commander of an air transport squadron that, among other things, flew from Tokyo to Hawaii and San Francisco back and forth during the Korean War. So we were like a bus company. We were regular customers out there. And in that period, I received a personal top-secret message from Washington saying, and it was sent to many commanders in jobs similar to mine, that if ever any crew members of my organization saw anything in the air that was unusual, unknown flying objects and all that, they were to immediately report that when they landed, and we were to question them thoroughly and then send that report to a certain office in the Air Force. Not long after that top-secret message had come to me, and I had briefed my pilots that they were to keep their eyes open, and if they did, they were bound by their business to report it. I had a captain of a C-54 come in who had just arrived from Honolulu to Tokyo, and he said, "Sir, I'll have to talk to you about something we saw while we were coming past Midway." And he said, "My crew members saw it." He said, "I had more than 60 passengers on my plane." He said, "They were excited about it. I've got to make the report." So I did, and I sent it to Washington. I never heard of it again until about 2 years ago. Finally picked up some news about it. But these happened. Now, how do you explain an object that appears beside my airplane up there flying along? This thing would fly quietly beside them off to the wingtip, and then would zoom ahead of them almost as though speed was nothing, and would go up vertically when they wanted to go up, and so on.
Right.
And stayed in sight for about an hour. Well, we had to report it thoroughly because my passengers were reporting it all over the city of Tokyo, inevitably, every coffee shop there.
Uh-huh.
There is something, I just have to say that I can't question what they saw, so I'll say there is something that happens in the air, flying object, and I'll be darned whether it is U.S. or even human created, or whether there's a chance that it is from outside our own sphere.
I see. Okay.
I never got an answer to the letter I wrote, and I don't think I was supposed to, but somewhere there is an office that keeps these records, and somewhere they have a pretty good idea of what they are.
I get it. Okay. All right. Let's turn our talk here now to things current. You've retired in what year did you retire? 63, did you say?
64.
64. From 1964 onward, and someone of your background and knowledge, when you look at the state of affairs in the world today, 1998, what do you see that is applicable to what you knew or the experience that you had in your career? with the world affairs, foreign policy, that type of thing?
Well, I would say that from my point of view, very shortly after retirement, I went to the Graduate School of Banking in Wisconsin.
Right.
And such men as Arthur Burns would be our lecturers and so on, and he was the head of the Federal Reserve at the time. I have been rather intimate with a certain group of bankers, and with my background, they wanted me in certain offices, so I served there, and I went to international meetings and so on, far beyond my banking experience ordinarily, and that sort of thing. There is power within that group, and I don't mean those that just go to work every day in a bank. I mean the money people that they represent, that we know about, but we don't know it enough. We don't know, we being the general public. It's a very strong function, of course. You control money, you control or the wealth, and you control what goes on in the world. Now, with the development of both transportation, which is global today, and most of all communications,
right,
with the networks, all that sort of thing, the world is becoming more one world than it ever was before. Whether this is beneficial, whether the people that are doing it for the benefit of the people of the world or for themselves,
right, that's up for question.
Matter of conjecture.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Is it fair to say that all the talk about a new world order, a one world government, could that possibly become a reality?
Well, in using the word possible, of course it is. There are weapons out there that are far beyond anything that's ever been used, and it might be done by other means. This business of mind control is people better start understanding it and knowing what it can do, because it isn't just mind control, it's other things. They can create a type of illness that people get that makes them do certain things that they wouldn't be doing otherwise, and then or it tries to make them do things that there's no way in the world they can do, so they're ill and they're in hospitals. This mind control thing is, they're going to have to change the name of it, because it isn't mind, it's just human control, the control of humanity. And since I've known some of its leaders pretty well, I'm not really active in it myself, but I've known some of the people lead. I think that it is a subject that we are overlooking as a nation, as all millions of us, not just a few professors in high office.
Let me ask you this, Colonel. What would it take today, in 1998, what would it take to stop something of that magnitude? Reverse its course or whatever. What would it take to reverse its course?
Hopefully, education.
Okay.
In other words, the more people know about this subject, the more chance we have to identify it and perhaps control it. But with people being more or less indifferent, thinking this is just something out of the comic strips or something like that, you don't get a chance to, any more than you would with a dog that hadn't been trained.
Right.
You'd be afraid of him.
Speaking to the listeners, what would you encourage them to do when you're talking about towards education and that type of thing? What would you encourage people to do to either insulate themselves or be able to avoid falling into whatever the game is?
Well, I say this rather frankly because I've done an awful lot of this kind of broadcasting. I think most of you people who are in this type of broadcasting, where you try to open up subjects for a lot of listeners, are doing a very good job. And I did radio work as far back as the 30s.
Right.
I'm just not talking about any certain person, but in other words, without knowledge, you really can't go too far in any subject.
Are there any telltale signs that people should be looking for, though? I mean, we're so grounded in our everyday lives. I'm sure that, you know, when we're talking about mind control or control of humanity, there are probably cues, or there are probably some type of telltale signs that people should look for. Are we looking at media? Are we looking at drugs that were prescribed? You know, there's a multitude of things that when you read the proceedings, the Senate proceedings on the behavioral modification hearings back in the 70s, it frightens you. When I read it, it chilled me, because a lot of the stuff that was talked about in there appears to be some, like, for example, the different types of drugs that they were experimenting with are drugs now that we see in our mainstream.
Yeah.
And, like, for example, I don't want to use names of any type of drugs, but there's a very popular antidepressant drug that is being prescribed today, I think overprescribed by a lot of doctors.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the drugs that came out of MKUltra research.
Yeah.
Are these things that we need to be watching for?
Well, that's an example of it in one area. Other things we don't know, content and structure of the food we eat every day. All we know is it comes out of a can. Well, what did the person intend when he prepared this and put it in the can?
Right. I understand what you're saying.
We have illnesses now, as I understand, and I'm no authority on this, that 100, 200 years ago people didn't know anything about. Things like that. It's, you can talk about general subjects, and I don't think people realize how serious it is. This country has actually a very inefficient transportation system. You have to know what I mean, the breadth of the field to see that.
Uh-huh.
But there's no reason in the world we can't have trains casually and efficiently running as they have in Japan at 250 miles an hour. And since that type of train has been put together and not a single one has had an accident, no person has been killed. Now, my word, we kill 8,000 or 10,000 people a year with trains. Now, that's just one thing, but why can't our people turn out things that are as good as that? And why do we expect that we should put everybody out on the highways and so on when all they want to do is go from Chicago to Detroit?
Right.
Things like that we don't notice. We are so accustomed to it that we don't think about it.
So we need to really wake up and smell the coffee, if you will.
When what?
We need to really wake up and smell the coffee.
Yeah. That's right. There's a lot of that must be done, and we must develop sources of people that understand these things and give them the means, one way or another, of getting this knowledge to the public.
Very good.
Because that's where it begins. If the public doesn't give a damn, then the rest of it
just goes to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Colonel Prouty, I want to thank you very much for the time and the interview. It's been very, very interesting. And I want to thank you also for, for your part that you played in acting in the military in defense of the country.
Well, it was something that came upon me rather casually from the back of a horse. I never expected to go where it went from there.
Yeah, well,
on and all that. Listen, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'd be glad to help you out anytime. And be sure when people ask for it that you provide at least a little bit of material that Len and I are giving you bet, so that they can learn more about it.
You bet you we will.
Good.
Thank you, Colonel, very much. And again, you take care.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.